Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians across the front line. In the Sumi regions, the Russians continued their counter offensive operations, following the Ukrainian counterattack on the western flank of the Russian Sumi incursion. The Russians expand their bridgehead across the border area in the Kharkiv region on the western bank of the Uskil river line, while they also continue offensive operations in the Kupiansk section of the front line. In the Donetsk region, there are numerous advances by the Russians in the western and southern parts of it, where the Russians are making attempts for the operational encirclement of Pokrovsk, improving their positions on both the western and eastern flank of the city, while also developing offensive operations in the vicinity of Kupiansk and the southwestern outskirts of the region. Starting out in the northern section of the front line in the Sumi region, the Russians continue their attempts to regain control over Kindrativka. They managed to regain control over the western forest patch area as well as the western streets of the town, leaving the Ukrainian forces in the northern outskirts of it, while also cutting off the main roads the Ukrainians are using to resupply their forces within Kindrativka, forcing them to be attacking from the western flank where they are resupplying their forces to the north and cutting off the Russian supply line in that direction. With this, heavy fighting continues over the settlement. According to Russian reports, very heavy Ukrainian attacks are taking place, where they're using numerous equipment and personnel that has been prepared for this counterattack. They've also redirected forces from other sections of the front line to the Sumi region for these counterattacks and new counterattack operations. Now we see that the Russians, with their reinforcements arriving, are able to regain the initiative and recapture some parts of the town. However, this is a very slow process as they are struggling to kick out the Ukrainian forces due to the large concentration of those. The Ukrainians are also supporting their forces with artillery and FPV drone strikes, which limits the Russian ability to counterattack the Ukrainian positions. However, the Russians with heavy shelling are still able to regain control over parts of the town slowly. Within the town of Kindrativka here on the western flank, as well as Yunekivka on the eastern flank, very heavy fighting takes place over both of these towns, while the third town being fought over is Smiropilya in the further eastern flank, where the Russians are doing additional crossings across the border area. With this, we see heavy fighting takes place all across the Russian foothold in the Sumi region in several concentrated pockets. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians continued their attempts to expand the bridgehead across the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions, where they managed to gain control over several additional forest patch areas to the north of Ambarne, reaching the outskirts of the town as the Russians continue developing defensive operations within the Kharkiv region. The Russians are here working on gaining control over these positions that leads up to the roads near Obokhivka and Koledziesne, where they're also developing offensive operations on the western flank of Kamyanka. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the roads, the towns, and the settlements, forest patch areas, everything in between the new Russian bridgehead across the border and the positions along the Uskil river line, gaining control over a part of the border area as a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border, and also to strengthen the logistical situation for the Russian forces here on the eastern flank for future offensive operations by the Russians towards the main highways, connecting the forces in the Vovchansk direction with the ones here in the eastern flank, significantly improving the supply situation for the Russian forces in the Kharkiv region for future offensive operations towards the south. In the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians continue offensive operations, where they managed to gain control over some first lines and expanding the zone of control slightly here on the western flank of Stepovano-Vasilivka. These are a general small-scale assault with small assault groups of Russian infantry moving through the cover of forest lines and forest patches, pushing the Ukrainians away from the highway, securing a buffer zone between the Russian positions along the highway and the Ukrainian forces into defensive positions to develop a safe route for their forces from Gotove in the southeast, the local logistical hub of Russian forces, to the front lines here near Kupiansk. The Russians are slow developing offensive operations on the southern flank of Petropavlivka, as they are generally doing some positional fighting here on the eastern bank of the Kupiansk direction. where the objective is to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainian forces while they are in this half circle with the Oskar River line at their backs. Further south in the direction of Donetsk, the Russians continued offensive operations on the pocket of the Ukrainian forces that was operationally circled west of the city. They are storming Novosibirsk, gaining almost full control over the town, leaving just a single street within the town remaining under Ukrainian control, while also gaining control over the last fortified position here on the high ground on the western flank of Novosibirsk. With this, the Russians are looking to gain control over the western bank of the river line. Gain control over this will allow them to tighten the encirclement over the Ukrainian forces, especially the ones in Shcherbinivka and along the fortified positions on the southwestern outskirts of Donetsk. The more pressure there are on the flanks of the Ukrainian positions, as well as the shorter the distance between the northern and southern flanks, the more casualties the Ukrainians will be taking during this operational encirclement. The Russians can now physically encircle the Ukrainian forces in the forward positions, to which they can develop offensive operations on the flanks to close the remaining parts of the pocket as the main area where Ukrainian forces are present, as within Shcherbinivka, as that is the widest and largest urban area within the pocket. The Ukrainian forces within Katerinivka and Kupiansk are also well fortified and entrenched. This allows them to hold these positions on the high ground overlooking the roads here on the western flank. The Russians will therefore prioritize gaining control over these areas before storming the remaining parts of the operationally encircled area here west of Donetsk. In general, this operational encirclement has been a big success for the Russian forces and a very costly endeavor for the Ukrainians. Moving on, there are additional attacks by the Russians. The Russians start storming Rusin Yar on the northeastern flank of Poltavka and Popiv Yar, where the Ukrainians have fortified positions on the northern flank of the town, overlooking the town on the high ground, similar to the western flank of Donetsk. At the same time, the Russians are continuously developing offensive operations here along the northern flank, following their alignment of the front line with the roads connecting to Novosibirsk. The Russians are here developing offensive operations on the western flank of Kupiansk to gain control over the fortified positions leading up to the Ryshkivka, not limiting their operational encirclement to Kupiansk itself, but developing the offensive operations to expand such an operational encirclement further upwards towards Ryshkivka and Kupiansk, including both towns, where the Russians may be looking to isolate Ryshkivka and Kupiansk from Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue offensive operations here as well, gaining control over additional fortified positions here to the west of Razina. The Russians are here working, gaining control over the fortified positions on the southern flank of Fedorivka, gaining control over Fedorivka, move onwards towards Zatishok and Sukhetske, before moving down towards Rudinske and Chervony Liman, gaining control over the northern flank of Pokrovsk, physically cutting off the northern highway and operationally encircling the city. In combination with these recent developments on the northern and eastern flanks of Pokrovsk, the Russians also managed to cut off the western supply route towards Odashnik, gaining control over the fortified position here to the west of the town, operationally encircling the Ukrainian forces within the town, leaving only the northern road to resupply their forces. The Russians will soon be gaining control over Odashnia with this move. Gaining control over the town will open the road for the coal mine here to the north of the town. Gaining control over both Odashnia and the coal mine here on the western flank of Pokrovsk will strengthen the Russian capabilities for the operational encirclement of the city. The Ukrainians would be left with just the supply lines here to the northwest, with the highway and railway leading towards the city of Dnipro, as well as the additional off-roads here near Rushine on the northwestern flank. These three roads are the ones that would be supplying the Ukrainian forces within Pokrovsk if the Russians are able to cut off the northern highway and gain control over the coal mine and Odashna here on the western flank. This would leave the Russians with fire control over the last remaining road in and out of Pokrovsk, leading to an operational encirclement similar to that of Bakhmut over not just Pokrovsk but Mirnorad as well. The Russian ability to hold these positions would be difficult because the Ukrainian forces would be able to launch armored mechanized counterattacks. However, the fact that the Russians are expanding in the northern flank here to the northeast of Pokrovsk to gain control over the fortified positions and defensive line here on the northeastern flank further secures their ability to hold the northern flank, and with their wide push on the western flank, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to safely re-establish the supply lines into Pokrovsk. Instead, the Russians will likely have a solid hold over the flanks of Pokrovsk for the operational encirclement of the city. This will be a very devastating move for the Ukrainians and can significantly impact the Ukrainian ability to further defend beyond that of the city if Russians gain control of it here within this summer period. And we're seeing a similar development in the region of Kupiansk, where the Russians are working on gaining control over the northern and southern flanks of the city, which would lead to the operational encirclement of it. With the developments towards Kupiansk as well, the Russians may look to operationally encircle that town as well, significantly limiting the Ukrainian ability to defend itself beyond that of the Donetsk region. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians also made additional advances, gaining full control over Skresenka, expanding the zone of control along the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, gaining control over the fortified areas in the position near Skresenka. The Russians also managed to advance along the fortified positions near Andreevka-Klevtsova along the main highway connecting Komar in the southeast with Andreevka-Klevtsova on the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. With this, the Russians are looking to gain control over the fortified positions, defensive lines remaining on the western outskirts of the southwestern Donetsk region. With this, the Russians are gaining almost full control, leaving just 3 settlements and a few defensive positions remaining here on the southwestern outskirts. There is the very southwestern outskirts with the areas near Komishovacha remaining under Ukrainian control along the border area. Along the defensive line of the Ukrainians here in the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia region, the Russians are actually fighting over the very eastern outskirts of the second line of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians will be working on the rear of it rather than the southern flank. This is why the Russians are not expanding zone of control here on the southern flank yet. Instead, they're working on Maliivka, Shevcheneve, Alexandrorad, and so on to gain control of the northern flank, bypassing the defensive positions and defensive lines by attacking the logistical positions in the rear at the weak point, bypassing the defensive positions. With their forces being split into the northern section as well in the Kharkiv direction, both with the previous Russian Kharkiv incursion and the new Kharkiv incursion, the bridgehead across the Oskar River line, the Sumi incursions, and the recent developments in the Zaporizhzhia region, the Ukrainian forces are split thinly across the front line, and with the intense fighting on the eastern section of the front line, it opens up for future offensive operations by the Russians into the Kherson region across the Dnieper River. If all of the Ukrainian forces are being relocated to the eastern section of the front line, then the defenses in Kherson would weaken. And with the statements by Trump that Putin told him he would look to gain control over the 4 regions within 60 days, or start an operation to gain control of the 4 regions within 60 days, then it is likely that the Russians will also launch an operation across Dnieper River to gain control over Kherson, as well as the entirety of Zaporizhzhia. This would either be a mega large-scale offensive, where they'll look to gain control over these large cities such as Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, as well as the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, or they expect a Ukrainian defensive collapse due to the attrition that they're taking across the front line, not to mention the long-range strikes by the Russian forces, where the Russians are now launching large-scale strikes with hundreds of drones, reaching up to 500, 600 drones a night, with addition to 20 or 30 cruise missiles and ballistic missiles being launched at Ukraine. Therefore, we will be seeing some escalations in the coming weeks and months. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.